Good to see you again. How are you?
Very good.
Good. I'm here again with my good friend Dave Patchett to discuss flat earth theory once more, but we have some questions that we skirted around last time I was here. So my first question to you, Dave, would be, can you discuss curvature experiments? Sorry, yes, experiments.
Curvature. If the Earth curves, it works out it's 8 inches per mile, and then the 8 inches squared for the second mile, third mile, fourth mile. Works out that over 6 miles, the Earth should curve 24 feet. Which means, in the case of the Bedford Canal, it should, because it's 6 miles and it's dead straight, and you can put your camera 8 inches above the water and look along it, it should dive behind the horizon 24 feet. And therefore it should be impossible to see a boat, for instance, that rose from one end to the other. And yet this experiment was done many times, 100 years ago, and recorded by Samuel Rowbotham. And always, with the use of a telescope, he could see the boat when it was 6 miles away, the whole of the boat, proving that, at least on water, the Earth is completely flat.
Okay. Would you discuss the UN with us?
Well, the thing about the UN, you've got it here, is that it uses the flat Earth for its flag and its emblem. So what does that tell you about what the UN is doing? See, I know, because they make the admission themselves, that the UN is the first stage in a world government, or the New World Order. You'll notice that embossed upon the flat Earth, on the UN flag, is a grid system with 33 sections. So they're also admitting the fact that they're all Masons. We all know that everybody in the establishment are Masons. So what are the Masons telling us? What are they telling you, for instance, because you don't believe in the flat Earth? They're telling you that they are so convinced, that you are so convinced about the globe, that hidden in plain sight, they feel free to tell you that the Earth is flat.
So it's to do with all of your thoughts that these people in control are making a mockery of what we believe to be just our perception of free will, when in fact everything contradicts that entirely.
I don't know about our perception of free will, that's another subject. But it's part of the magic that they believe in, because essentially they are Luciferians engaged in a kind of magic. They pre-program our thoughts. They're in charge of our education. And they obviously enjoy tittering to one another about the things that we believe in, because they know that the things we believe in can be totally ridiculous.
You have many terms for them. What are they?
More or less asked me this last week. They're the people that own and control and run society.
No, but your actual terms for them.
Well, I can run them off, but essentially they're secret societies and the ultra rich. But I could run them off. It would include Zionists, Jesuits, Freemasons, Knights of Malta, the Pope, now that the Pope is a Jesuit. The Roman Catholic Church is involved as well. Royalty would be another good example. All royalty have been Freemasons for the last hundreds of years.
Okay. And can I ask you about the east-west and vice versa planes?
Certainly you can. I'll go and get my globe. Yeah, this is a good one. Pretty obvious. And you should have difficulty in explaining this, being a round earther.
Mm-hmm.
You're catching a plane from Heathrow to New York. The Earth is travelling at about 600 miles an hour from west to east. Now, whichever way you go, because you can go also from New York to Heathrow, it's going to take about 7.5 hours. That's a fact. Sometimes it's 7 hours, sometimes it's 8 hours. But it's the same sort of timing each way.
Okay.
But that doesn't make any sense at all when you think about it, because when you take off at Heathrow, you're heading towards New York at 500 miles an hour, but New York is heading towards you at 600 miles an hour. That should cut the time for the journey, shouldn't it? For the journey, it should be only about 3 hours. Conversely, when you take off from New York, you're trying to get to London, but the world is moving farther away from you. London is moving further away from you because the Earth is supposed to be turning at 600 miles an hour. You should never reach London. In fact, London should come up behind you about 3 days later. But this doesn't happen, and the only reason for the fact that it doesn't happen must be that the Earth is still.
Could you not argue that it's a self-contained environment with the atmosphere and the stratosphere and all the other spheres?
Jamie, that's a really clever point.
Thank you.
What you're really saying is that, yes, the Earth is turning 600 miles an hour, but so is the atmosphere, and therefore we don't notice it. But I would answer that by saying, but when you go from London to New York, you're cutting through an atmosphere that you're saying is travelling at 600 miles against you. Well, the plane would just be a wreck. It would just be torn to the ground. A hurricane only goes at 250 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
600 miles an hour would just whip the plane into a crash in the middle of the ocean.
That does sound like crazy to me. So, now, Australia to South America. Would you discuss?
This is the other thing about planes. And this isn't an isolated example. If you travel in the southern hemisphere on a plane from continent to continent, all of the examples are like this, not just this one. But this is probably the most extreme one. If you're travelling from Adelaide in Australia to Buenos Aires in South America, the only sensible way to go, have a look at this, Jamie, the only sensible way to go would be to go to New Zealand and refuel so that you can hop across there, possibly 600 miles, maybe 7,000 miles, to Buenos Aires. That's the sensible way to do it. What do planes actually do? Well, they go from Australia deep into the southern hemisphere, across the equator, deep into the northern hemisphere, to San Francisco, then down to Houston, and then on to Buenos Aires. Doesn't make any sense at all. You know, you're wasting half of your fuel. On the other hand, when you look at the flat Earth map, and you see the same trip from Adelaide, Australia, a straight line to San Francisco here, Houston here, and then down to Buenos Aires in Brazil.
I understand.
A straight line. Perfect sense on the flat Earth map.
Could it have something to do with ownership of political airspace?
No. No, planes don't run like that.
Okay, so the climate, is there distinction between the north and the south?
Glad you mentioned that, Jamie. Because if the sun is over there and you imagine the Earth spinning, it doesn't matter about the angle of the Earth. It really doesn't matter, because it's going to be at the same angle when it gets on the other side of the Sun, because the Earth spins around the Sun. Therefore, the same amount, and I promise you this is true, no matter how you cut it, the same amount of light from the Sun, the same amount of heat from the Sun will hit the North Pole and the South Pole. So the climate should be the same. But what is the reality, Jamie? The reality is that the Antarctic is 50 degrees colder than the Arctic. Doesn't make any sense, does it? The Arctic, there's no living things there, just a few penguins and a few scientists in their cosy little bases. In the Arctic, on the other hand, you have summer meadows during their brief summer. You have all sorts of species of flowers and animals, many living things, completely different climate. Can't explain it on the globe, can explain it, as per usual, on the flat Earth. Because on the flat Earth you can see the sun and the moon going around here, 3,000 miles up in the sky, encircling all these temperate countries which are quite close to Iceland. Therefore Iceland receives some warmth. On the other hand, the Antarctic is isolated with frozen waste. The further out you go from the sea, the colder it is, the more impossible it is to live. It's a total icy, freezing wasteland on the other side. It's isolated. So naturally, the climate, even close to the sea, is 50 degrees colder than it is in the Arctic.
How do you know what the Antarctic is like, Dave?
Well, we know because there are science bases there. They don't go far in, but they're all the way around it, and they record the temperature. And no one would argue with this. No one from the globe system would argue with this. It's a conceded fact, even in pseudoscience.
Beyond the mountains?
What mountains?
You said that there was a boundary to the Antarctic.
Yeah, but it's an icy plateau. It's only 200 feet high, on average. It's an icy plateau. I don't think there's many mountains, but there might be mountains. Who knows? You'd have to explore. And as I explained last week, we're not allowed to explore.
And yet there are bases there.
Yeah, around the outside.
For what purpose?
They don't tell us. All we know is that they are scientists. I don't know, because the Antarctic is so exotic, because there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world, they are studying it.
But you say
For all I know.
A deathscape.
Sorry?
You say that it's a deathscape.
Yeah, it is.
So how is it exotic?
Well, it's exotic because it's rare. Now, on the outer fringes, it is possible to set up bases. It's possible to do all sorts of scientific experiments. Who knows what they're getting up to? All kinds of black operations could be done there, but I don't know. That's a guess. Maybe we shouldn't even guess. Maybe they're finding out about the extent of this plateau. You know, if it goes on and on.
Dave,
If there are other worlds.
this plateau.
But that's guessing.
You can't call it plateau.
Plateau. Yeah.
Alright.
Jamie, I should say, is much more educated than me. I had secondary school education, but Jamie has been to college, I think.
My ignorance grew later on in life.
Okay.
What about
He drinks.
eclipses, the sun and the moon?
Well, the eclipse, that's one for the scientists. Their explanation is truly amazing. Because to get a perfect eclipse, as we do, it means that the sun and the moon have to be exactly the same size. Now, explain, please, scientists, how this happens, because we know that the sun is much bigger than the moon. So explain it they do. They say that it just happens by coincidence that the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun and exactly 400 times further away from the sun than it is from the earth. This means we get a perfect eclipse. Fair enough. It's a pretty big coincidence. I mean, I would say that was 1,000,000 to 1 coincidence. And they go on from that to explain why we never see the dark side of the moon, the other side of the moon. We never see it. How come? Well, they say, it's a bit of a coincidence, but it just happens that the moon takes 28 days to go around the earth, and it takes 28 days to go around on its own axis. And these two timings are exact to a millisecond. I mean, if it was just a quarter of a second out, after 100 years or so, we see the other side of the moon, but we never do. This is a pretty big coincidence, isn't it? Isn't that another 1,000,000 to 1 coincidence? I think it is. Put the two coincidences together, you have 1,000,000,000 to 1 coincidence. It's virtually impossible. Now, in science, when you've got a theory, the globe theory and the moon theory, that's their heliocentric theory, needs 1,000,000,000 to 1 coincidence in order to work. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to put it in a bin and go back to the drawing board. But they don't. They put it in textbooks and teach it to everybody, including you, Jamie. It's very sad.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier that the Earth revolves around the sun, and yet I heard you say the opposite.
The sun revolves around the Earth.
That's what I've heard.
That's on the flat Earth model.
Okay.
Don't get confused.
So when you say that, you're just arguing for my benefit.
I'm arguing from the point of view of debunking the heliocentric theory, which you support.
By arguing in favour of it, so as to...
No, by explaining the scientific explanation of it and how ridiculous the scientific explanation is. Because these are pseudoscientists. I firmly believe that the scientists at the top are deliberately misleading us. It can only be deliberate because they can't be that stupid. So it's about deception. Because it's Freemasonry, and the whole Freemasonry idea is based on deception.
We've tackled this already, and we spoke about space travel last week as well. So, if we could close up talking about Einstein and Tesla.
Yeah, very interesting. Who do you think was the best scientist?
What, on an inventive premise? Probably Tesla.
All right. On an experimental premise.
Einstein.
Okay. And on a production premise, who made the best objects for use?
Well, who presented the best theories to humanity's benefit to generate that production?
Well, it's simpler than that. Who made the best inventions?
That's who I said, Tesla, yeah.
Yeah, Tesla. Yeah, you're right 2 times out of 3. If I asked you what experiments,
You only asked me 2 questions out of those 3.
you asked yourself one at the start. Right? Now, the one where I think you're wrong is you said that Einstein did the best experiments. I don't think Einstein is known for any experiments. Can you name a single experiment that Einstein's famous for?
Well, he must have done some, because his equations are regarded as probably the most thoroughly explored in all of mankind's history.
Well, that's because nobody can understand them, Jamie. He was such a genius that his equations could not be followed by any other mathematician.
Are you saying that they are purely mathematical?
I'm saying they're purely philosophical. He was proving the heliocentric system. This is why he was always sticking his tongue out and pointing to the head.
Is
He was
one
more or
of-
less telling you, Jamie, that you're mad if you believe him. Whereas Tesla made so many inventions. I think he had 700 patents. He invented things that we're still using today, and yet he gets none of the glory. As far as I know, the only thing that Einstein got involved in, and then more or less for moral support, was the building of the atom bomb.
That was a good invention.
No, it's a horrible invention.
It was a horrible invention.
Yeah.
So he had no experiments?
As far as I know, he's certainly not famous for any experiments, because I keep saying this to people who believe the scientists. I say, when they start, they always quote Einstein and say, no conception of physics, elementary physics, they say. And they usually mention Einstein, and I say, well, what experiments is he famous for? And they say, oh, I don't know. And then I say, and what did he make for mankind? Like alternative currents, which still manufactures our electricity today, was done by Tesla 100 years ago.
Well, who was the first of the two? Einstein was the first of the two.
Yeah. They were more or less the same time. I think Tesla might have been slightly earlier.
Do you know that for a fact?
Not for a fact.
And why or how do physicists in school base a lot of their theories around Einstein's work?
I don't know. I suppose it's great fun trying to explain relativity. It seems to me that relativity was full of quite a lot of nonsense. We know that the speed of light varies. We know that it slows up when it goes through water. We know, if we've got a brain, that holding an envelope in the air and saying that in space it's possible to make shortcuts and you bend the envelope like so. Well, if you believe that, I'm afraid you're very gullible. If you think that you can bend space to your advantage in that way.
Are you talking about wormholes?
All of those things
Yeah.
are theories, strictly theories, science fiction.
Because Einstein wasn't an astronaut.
Because nothing's been proved. I don't believe there's been an astronaut unless you count going round in an orbit about 300 miles up. I'm not even sure about that, but yeah, it's possible. But when they did the Apollo shots of the Earth, for instance, we know that they were faked about 250, 300 miles up through a round window. So that may be as far as they ever went up.
Well, what about Tom Hanks?
What about Tom Hanks?
Apollo 12.
Oh, interesting, yeah. Yeah, Tom Hanks. Am I right in thinking he made a film which suggested that there might have been fakery involved?
I don't think so. I think it happened.
Yeah.
They closed the hole with like duct tape and something like an adhesive that enabled them to fly through the Earth's environment without burning up. Like there was a really important part of that shuttle,
Right.
and that's how they landed. And
So they're all heroes. So it's a normal American thing. The cleverer comment to make about the Apollo, what was it, 1 to 17 or something? The first one was 11, which is strange. That's the one that Tom Hanks must have been mentioning. It's Apollo 13. Because Apollo 13 killed 6 astronauts. The trouble is, the 6 astronauts are still alive. They're working in American colleges. They've all got plum jobs. Some of them haven't even bothered to change their names. But if you go on YouTube, you can see photographs of them before and them now. 40 years later. Maybe the photographs were taken 20 years later. But you can recognise them. People don't change that much. and some of them, as I say, kept the same names. So they sent the rocket up and then allowed it to explode in the sea, presumably, or to explode and then go in the sea. This enabled the Apollo efforts to conclude, because they'd done enough. They sent 6 to the moon and got 6 come back, all the astronauts safe, but it was time now to have an excuse not to do it anymore, because their point had been made. And the main point that they made was that the Earth is round. And they also used up a hell of a lot of money. They were getting £30 billion a year from the American taxpayer to play about and fakery and Photoshop photographs.
Okay.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to conclude this interview, Dave?
We covered all those things there, yeah.
What things?
All those things.
I just asked you all
list.
these questions off the top of my head.
I know. Just to say that at the beginning you saw one of my paintings, and I hope you don't think, because a lot of people think that maybe I'm mad and take drugs, and that's why I have strange theories like the flat earth. But in actual fact, I've never taken drugs in all my life. I also don't take alcohol, unlike Jamie behind the picture. And this is just imagination. And the reason I'm attracted to flat earth is because I'm not educated and I'm imaginative enough to know that all things are possible. And having studied, as I tried to say last week, 9/11 and the moon landings, studied those in depth, I'm positive that they could be lying about everything. And I see a lot of proof in flat earth theory that tells me that the earth is flat.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Jamie.
Alright.
Okay. I tried to be louder.